If you've got $6, I'm done here, Ethan Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of conversation like a blade across glass, and for a split second, even the clinking of silverware seemed to hesitate before the laughter began to rise, slow at first, then louder, spreading table to table as if it had permission to exist. Marcus Reed didn't move right away, standing just inside the restaurant's warm golden light. The kind that made polished wood glow, and wine glasses shimmer like something out of a magazine, his coat thin against the chilled air that followed him in from outside, a faint draft slipping past the closing door behind him, his hands still at his sides, fingers rough, cracked at the edges, carrying the quiet history of too many winters spent unnoticed. The hostess near the entrance avoided his eyes, pretending to straighten menus that were already aligned, while a couple seated by the window leaned in just enough to watch without being obvious, their curiosity wrapped in polite discomfort. Marcus finally stepped forward, slow, measured, each footfall soft against the hardwood floor, as if he understood that he didn't belong in a place where every inch of space had been curated for people who never had to ask twice for anything. Ethan stood near the center of the room, tailored suit sharp, posture effortless. The kind of confidence that came from never having his authority questioned, one hand resting casually against the back of a chair while the other held a folded receipt, his expression fixed somewhere between amusement and impatience, like this moment was already beneath him. "You heard me," he added, louder now, making sure the room stayed with him. "This isn't a shelter." And that was enough to pull another ripple of laughter from the diners, some quick, some hesitant, but all loud enough to fill the silence Marcus hadn't yet broken. Marcus reached into his coat pocket, slow enough that it drew attention without asking for it, and pulled out a few crumpled bills, smoothing them carefully between his fingers as if they deserved respect no matter how little they were worth, the paper catching the light briefly before he stepped closer to the nearest table, not sitting, not asking again, just placing the money down with a quiet precision that didn't match the way he was being seen. The $6 rested there like something heavier than currency, like a marker, a memory, something that belonged to a moment no one else in the room could recognize. Ethan let out a short laugh under his breath, shaking his head as he glanced around, inviting the room to share in what he clearly believed was an obvious conclusion. "That won't even cover a drink," he said, his tone light but edged with something colder underneath, and a man at the bar chuckled openly, raising his glass as if the entire exchange had become part of the evening's entertainment. Marcus didn't react to the laughter, didn't flinch or shrink or retreat the way people expected someone in his position to do. Instead he looked at the table, at the bills he had just set down, his eyes steady, focused, as if the noise around him existed on a different plane entirely. The overhead lights reflected faintly in his gaze, catching just enough to make it seem like there was something deeper beneath the surface. Something the room wasn't prepared to see. A server paused mid-step a few feet away, tray balanced carefully in one hand, watching without meaning to, her expression caught between concern and uncertainty, unsure which side of the moment she was supposed to stand on. Outside, through the tall front windows, the city moved on without noticing, headlights passing in long streaks, people walking by with coats pulled tight, unaware that inside this carefully controlled space, something had begun to shift, subtle at first, almost invisible, like the air right before a storm changes in a way you can't explain but can't ignore either. Marcus lifted his head slightly, his gaze moving from the table to Ethan, not challenging, not pleading, just present, as if he were holding on to something that didn't require permission to exist. The laughter around the room began to thin, not because anyone had said anything to stop it, but because something in Marcus's stillness made it harder to continue. Like a joke that suddenly didn't land the same way once you looked at it too closely. Ethan's smile lingered, but only just a fraction longer than it needed to, and in that fraction, there was the faintest hesitation, so small it could have been missed, but it was there, a crack no one had expected, not yet, not fully, but enough to make the room feel different, enough to make the warmth of the lights feel just a little less comfortable. Enough to suggest that whatever was about to happen next would not belong to the laughter anymore. The $6 stayed on the table, unmoved, almost untouched by the air around them, and Marcus Reed let his hand rest there for just a second longer than necessary, his fingers hovering as if they remembered something the room did not, something tied not to the value of the money but to the weight behind it. He pulled his hand back slowly, the motion controlled, deliberate, not rushed, not defensive. And for a moment it felt like the entire space adjusted around that single movement, like a camera shifting focus without anyone noticing. Ethan Whitmore exhaled through his nose, a quiet sign of impatience, and tapped 2 fingers against the chair beside him, the rhythm sharp, out of place against the soft jazz playing through the speakers. "We are not doing this," he said, his tone dropping slightly, less performative now, more clipped, as if he was ready to end the scene and move on to something more deserving of his time. A few of the diners leaned back in their seats, interest fading just enough for them to return to their meals, though their ears stayed tuned to the exchange, waiting for whatever would happen next. Marcus looked down at the table again, not at the money this time, but at the surface itself, the polished wood reflecting a faint distortion of his own face, stretched slightly by the grain, unfamiliar but steady. He reached up and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. A small gesture that revealed nothing and everything at once, a habit that belonged to a different version of him, one that had once cared about details no one here would associate with him now. The server who had paused earlier took a cautious step forward, her tray still balanced, unsure if she was supposed to intervene or disappear, her eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan for direction, then back to Marcus, as if searching for a signal that would tell her how this moment should be handled. Ethan noticed the hesitation and gave a short, dismissive wave. "It is fine," he said, not looking at her, his attention fixed entirely on Marcus now. "He is leaving." The certainty in his voice firm, practiced, the kind that usually ended conversations before they had a chance to become anything more. Marcus did not move toward the door, did not gather his things or offer an apology. Instead he shifted his weight slightly, just enough to square his shoulders, the fabric of his coat catching the light differently, revealing its wear more clearly now, the frayed edges, the thinness that spoke of years rather than days. Outside, a gust of wind pressed briefly against the glass, a soft thud that echoed faintly inside, and for a second the warmth of the room felt almost artificial, like a stage set against something colder and more real just beyond reach. Marcus lifted his gaze again, not to challenge, not to argue, but to meet Ethan's eyes directly, and there was something in that look that did not align with the role he had been placed into, something steady, grounded. As if he had already accepted an outcome that no one else in the room could yet see. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to suggest that the moment was not unfolding exactly as expected, his fingers pausing against the chair, the rhythm broken. "You made your point," Ethan said, quieter now, though still carrying across the space. "There is nothing here for you." And the words hung in the air, not as sharp as before, but heavier, like they were trying to settle into place and finding resistance. Marcus's gaze did not drop, did not flicker, and in that stillness, the room began to notice something it had missed earlier, something subtle, almost intangible, a presence that did not belong to someone asking for permission, but to someone who had once given it. The server lowered her tray slightly, her grip loosening just enough to show that her attention had fully shifted, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet focus. As if she was witnessing something she could not yet explain but did not want to interrupt, a man at the bar, who had laughed the loudest before, now turned his glass slowly in his hand, the ice inside clinking softly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he studied Marcus more carefully, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he understood. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, even, carrying without effort, not raised, not forced. Just clear enough to cut through the remaining noise, and when he did, the room did not laugh this time, did not react the way it had moments ago, because something in the air had already changed, something that made the space feel smaller, quieter, more aware, as if the walls themselves were listening now, waiting for the next word to land. Marcus Reed's voice did not rise, did not push against the room, but it carried with a quiet certainty that made people lean in without realizing it. "I am not here for the menu," he said, each word placed carefully, as if he had already measured the distance they needed to travel. and the statement lingered in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Ethan Whitmore blinked once, the faintest pause, his expression tightening at the edges as he tried to recalibrate the situation back into something he could control. "Then you are definitely in the wrong place," he replied, forcing a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and a couple near the center table exchanged a glance, the kind that said they were no longer entirely comfortable laughing. Marcus shifted his gaze slightly, not away, but across the room, taking in the details without appearing to study them, the arrangement of tables, the spacing, the lighting that had been designed to flatter every surface, and there was something in the way he looked that felt familiar to the space itself, like recognition rather than curiosity. His hand moved again, this time not toward the money, but toward the edge of the table, his fingers brushing the wood lightly, almost absent-minded, but with a precision that suggested memory, not chance, as if he knew exactly where he was standing without needing to check. The server lowered her tray completely now, setting it carefully on a nearby stand. Her attention fully captured, her earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet awareness that something about this man did not match the role he had been given. "You said $6? Marcus continued, his tone unchanged, calm, grounded. "That is not for a meal." And the way he said it made the number feel different, not small, not insignificant, but specific, intentional, like a key rather than a limit. Ethan let out a short breath, a controlled exhale, and glanced briefly toward the entrance, as if considering whether to escalate the situation or end it quickly, but something held him in place, something subtle, almost instinctive, that told him walking away now would not resolve what had already started. A man at the bar set his glass down with a soft click, the sound sharper than it should have been, drawing a few eyes in his direction before they returned to Marcus, who had not moved, not retreated, not advanced. Simply existed in the center of a moment that no longer belonged to Ethan. Alone, outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the front windows and briefly illuminating the room in a different tone, cooler, more revealing, and for that second, the polished surfaces looked less like luxury and more like something carefully maintained, something that required effort to keep intact. Marcus lifted his chin just slightly, enough to align his posture fully, and in that small adjustment, there was a shift. Not visible to everyone, but felt, like the room itself had recognized a change in position, a rebalancing that had nothing to do with who was standing where and everything to do with who held weight in the space. Ethan's fingers curled against the back of the chair, no longer tapping, no longer casual, his attention now fixed with a focus that bordered on unease, though he would not have named it that. "Then explain it," he said, the words coming out more direct than before, less for the audience and more for himself, as if he needed to understand why this interaction was not ending the way it should. Marcus met his gaze again, steady, unwavering, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something beneath the calm, not anger, not defiance, but a quiet resolve that suggested he had carried this moment longer than anyone else in the room had even been aware of it. "It is for a promise," Marcus said, and the word promise settled differently than everything that had come before, heavier, anchored, pulling the attention of the room inward, narrowing the distance between every person present and the man they had just dismissed. The server's breath caught softly, almost inaudible, but enough to mark the shift, and the man at the bar leaned forward slightly, his earlier amusement replaced by something closer to curiosity, something that asked a question he had not considered asking before. Ethan's expression faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker that passed quickly but left something behind, a crack in the certainty he had been standing on, and the room, now fully quiet, seemed to hold itself there, suspended, waiting for the meaning of that promise to reveal itself, waiting for the next piece of a story they had unknowingly stepped into to finally take shape. The word promise did not echo, but it settled into the room like something older than the polished floors and curated lighting, something that did not belong to the moment yet somehow defined it, and Marcus Reed let the silence stretch just long enough for it to be felt, not forced, not dramatic, but natural, like a pause in a conversation that had been waiting years to continue. Ethan Whitmore shifted his stance slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other, a subtle adjustment that betrayed a flicker of discomfort he would not have admitted, his eyes narrowing just enough to study Marcus more closely, as if searching for a detail he had missed the first time. "A promise to vous?" he asked, the question sharper now, less confident, more direct, as though he needed clarity to regain control. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted past Ethan, toward the far wall where a series of framed photographs hung in perfect alignment, each one capturing a different stage of the restaurant's life: ribbon cuttings, smiling executives, carefully staged moments of success. And his eyes lingered there for a second longer than expected, as if he recognized something not in the image itself but in what had been left out of it. A woman seated near that wall turned slightly in her chair, following his line of sight, her curiosity pulling her attention away from her meal entirely now, her fork resting untouched on the plate as she tried to piece together what she was witnessing. Marcus took a slow breath, the kind that steadies rather than fills, and stepped one pace closer to the table, not enough to invade space, just enough to anchor himself more firmly within it, his hand brushing the edge again, this time with intention, his fingers tracing a faint line along the grain. And there was something precise in that movement, something practiced, like a habit formed long before this version of him existed. "To this place," he said finally, his voice still even, but carrying a weight that shifted the meaning of the room itself, and the words did not land as a claim, not yet, but as a connection, something that linked him to the space in a way no one had considered. Ethan let out a quiet, incredulous breath, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly in a reflexive attempt to dismiss what he had just heard, but the reaction did not hold. It faltered halfway, leaving behind something less certain. "You are telling me you have a promise with a restaurant," he said, and a few scattered chuckles tried to surface around the room, but they did not rise fully this time. They faded quickly, uncertain of their place. Marcus's expression did not change, not offended, not defensive, just steady. And he lifted his hand slightly, not pointing, not gesturing broadly, but indicating the space with a small, controlled motion that felt more like acknowledgement than explanation. "Not a restaurant," he said. "A beginning." And the word beginning shifted something deeper than the surface of the conversation, pulling the room into a different frame, one that suggested history rather than transaction. The server who had been watching took a step closer without realizing it, drawn in by the quiet gravity of his words, her eyes moving between Marcus and the photographs on the wall, as if trying to connect them, to find the thread that would make sense of what she was hearing. Ethan's posture straightened, his shoulders pulling back as he attempted to reassert the authority that had defined him at the start of the night, but there was a hesitation now, a fraction of a second before each movement, like he was recalculating with every breath. "We have records of every opening, every owner, every investor," he said, his tone firm, but not as absolute as before. "There is nothing here that involves you." And the statement hung there, not as final as he intended, but as something waiting to be tested. Marcus lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, his eyes settling on the $6 again, the bills still lying exactly where he had placed them, untouched, unchanged, and for a moment, the room followed his focus, drawn back to that small, simple detail that had started everything, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, not stronger, not louder, but clearer, as if he had decided that the next step did not require permission, only truth. Outside, the wind eased, the glass no longer trembling under its pressure, and the quiet inside deepened, the kind that comes when a room realizes it has been wrong about something but has not yet learned what that something is. And in that space, suspended between certainty and realization, Marcus prepared to close the distance between what he knew and what they believed, not with force, not with volume, but with the same steady presence that had already begun to reshape the room around him. The room did not return to normal after Marcus Reed spoke, it stayed suspended in that quiet space where certainty no longer felt reliable, and Ethan Whitmore could feel it even if he refused to name it. The subtle shift in attention, the way the diners were no longer looking at him for direction but at Marcus for answers, and that imbalance pressed against him in a way he was not used to. He took a step forward, closing the distance by just a foot, enough to reassert presence, enough to remind The room who was supposed to hold authority here. "You are mistaken," he said, slower now, each word chosen with care. "This place was built by people who actually invested in it, people who have names on contracts, on records, on everything that matters." And as he spoke, his hand gestured slightly toward the framed photographs again, toward the curated history displayed on the wall like proof that could not be questioned. Marcus did not follow the gesture this time. His attention remained steady, grounded in the present rather than the images meant to define it, and he let Ethan finish without interruption, without challenge, allowing the words to settle fully before responding. And when he did, his voice did not rise, did not push, it simply existed with clarity. "And before the contracts," he said, "before the records, before the investors decided it was worth their time, there was an idea." And the word idea landed differently, not abstract, but specific, anchored as if it belonged to a place that still existed beneath everything built on top of it. A faint movement rippled through the room, not sound, but attention. Shifting again, people leaning slightly, listening more carefully than they had before, as if something they had dismissed too quickly was now asking to be understood. The man at the bar straightened his posture, his earlier amusement gone completely, replaced by a focused stillness, while the woman near the photographs turned fully in her chair, no longer pretending to be uninvolved. Ethan's jaw tightened, the muscle near his temple shifting subtly, and for a moment he looked not at Marcus, but at the $6 still resting on the table, the small, ordinary bills that now seemed to hold more weight than they should, and something about their presence unsettled him, though he could not explain why. "Everyone has a story," Ethan replied, his tone controlled but thinner now, less certain. "That does not make it true." And the statement was meant to close the door again, to bring the moment back into something manageable, something that fit within the structure he understood. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly, not in retreat, but in reflection, his gaze settling once more on the table, on the grain of the wood, on the exact place where his fingers had rested moments earlier, and then he reached into his coat again, slow, deliberate, the movement drawing every eye in the room without a single word being spoken. He did not pull out money this time, but something smaller, something flat, worn at the edges. And when he placed it beside the $6, the sound it made was almost nothing, a soft touch against the surface, but it carried through the silence like a signal. It was an old receipt, faded, the ink barely holding on, the paper creased from years of being kept, not used, and Marcus did not push it forward, did not present it like evidence, he simply let it sit there, next to the bills, as if it belonged exactly where it had been placed. Ethan's eyes dropped to it almost involuntarily, his focus narrowing as he leaned in just slightly, enough to read the top line, enough to catch the date, and something in his expression shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to break the rhythm of his certainty. The server stepped closer without realizing it, drawn in by the object, her breath quiet but uneven now, her gaze moving between the receipt and Marcus's face, as if she was trying to confirm that the two were connected in a way that made sense. Marcus's voice came again, low, steady. $6, he said, not repeating the number as a defense, but as a reference, a point anchored in time. "That is what it cost the first night this place opened." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that did not ask for belief but demanded recognition. A silence followed, deeper than before, heavier, and in that silence, Ethan Whitmore stared at the faded receipt, the date, the amount, the name barely visible at the bottom, and for the first time since this moment began, he did not speak immediately, because something in front of him no longer aligned with the story he had been so certain of, and the room, fully still now, waited as the first cracks in that certainty began to widen. The receipt did not look important at first glance, just a thin piece of paper worn down by time, its edges softened, its ink faded into a fragile gray that seemed ready to disappear entirely. But the longer Ethan Whitmore stared at it, the less it resembled something ordinary, and the more it began to feel like a thread being pulled from a story he had never questioned. His fingers hovered near the table, not touching the receipt. Not yet, as if there was something about it that required a different kind of permission, something beyond the authority he had relied on moments earlier. The room remained still, not in tension now, but in a quiet, almost reverent pause, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would not be loud, would not be dramatic, but would matter in a way that could not be undone. Marcus Reed did not rush to fill the silence, he did not push the moment forward. Instead he allowed it to breathe, his gaze resting not on Ethan, but on the space between them, on the table that now held both the $6 and the memory they represented, and there was a calm in his posture that did not ask for recognition, only presence. A soft hum from the ceiling lights became noticeable, the kind of background sound that usually went ignored, but now stood out in the absence of everything else, and outside the windows, the city continued its motion, cars passing, distant footsteps moving along the sidewalk, all of it disconnected from the stillness inside. Ethan finally leaned in just enough to read more clearly, his eyes tracing the faint lettering, the dates stamped near the top, older than he expected, older than the version of the restaurant he had come to manage, and then his gaze moved lower, to the total, $6. Printed in a font that no longer matched the current system, and something in his expression shifted again, not sharply, but gradually, like a realization forming piece by piece. The server took another small step forward, her hands now empty, her attention fully anchored in the moment, and she found herself holding her breath without meaning to, as if the act of breathing too loudly might disrupt something delicate. Marcus spoke again, softer this time, not because he needed to lower his voice, but because the room no longer required volume to listen. "It was not much," he said, his words carrying a quiet reflection. "But it was enough to begin." And the way he said begin made it sound less like a point in time and more like something alive, something that had grown beyond its origin yet still carried it within. Ethan's hand lowered slightly, his fingertips brushing the edge of the receipt for just a second, not picking it up, not claiming it, just acknowledging its presence, and that brief contact seemed to settle something inside him, not fully, but enough to open a space where certainty used to be. The photographs on the wall, once a clear narrative of success, now felt incomplete, like pages missing from a story that had been simplified for display, and a few of the diners glanced toward them again, not with admiration this time, but with questions forming quietly beneath the surface. Marcus shifted his weight subtly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to show that he was not here to confront, not here to demand anything, and that absence of aggression made the moment heavier, not lighter, because it removed the expectation of conflict and replaced it with something harder to navigate, understanding. "People forget the first night," Marcus continued, his gaze lifting slightly toward the room, not addressing anyone directly, but including them all. "They remember the success, the expansion, the numbers, but they forget what it felt like when there was nothing certain." And his words moved through the space like a slow current, touching each person differently, some with curiosity, some with quiet discomfort, some with a recognition they could not explain. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either, caught somewhere in between, and for the first time, he did not look like the person in control of the room. He looked like someone standing inside a moment that was unfolding without him, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. The $6 remained on the table, unchanged, but now they no longer looked small. They looked deliberate, intentional, like a marker placed with purpose, and beside them, the receipt carried a weight that extended far beyond its size, anchoring the present to something older, something that had not been erased, only overlooked. Marcus's gaze returned to Ethan, steady, patient. And in that look there was no accusation, no demand for apology, only a quiet invitation to see what had been there all along, and the room, held in that suspended stillness, seemed to lean into that invitation, waiting not for a reaction, but for a realization to finally take shape. The realization did not arrive all at once, it moved slowly through Ethan Whitmore like a shadow shifting across a wall, subtle at first, then undeniable, his eyes still fixed on the receipt as if the longer he looked, the more it would confirm what he was beginning to understand, and when he finally reached down and lifted it from the table, the motion was careful, almost hesitant, as though he was handling something fragile not because of its material, but because of what it represented. The paper bent slightly between his fingers, and he turned it just enough to catch the light more clearly, scanning the faded lines again, the date, the total, and then the name at the bottom, barely visible, almost erased by time, but not completely gone, and his breath caught, not sharply, not audibly, but enough to shift his posture, enough to make the space between him and Marcus feel different. The room watched without speaking. Every pair of eyes drawn to that single piece of paper, to the moment unfolding around it, and even the soft music that had been playing seemed distant now, as if it no longer belonged to the scene. Marcus did not move, did not step forward or back. He simply stood where he was, his presence steady, grounded, allowing Ethan the space to arrive at the truth on his own terms. And that patience carried a quiet strength that no one in the room could ignore. Ethan lowered the receipt slightly, his gaze lifting from the paper to Marcus, searching his face as if to confirm what the evidence had already begun to reveal, and for the first time, there was no trace of dismissal in his expression, only uncertainty, layered with something deeper, something closer to recognition. This, Ethan started, his voice quieter now, the confidence that had defined him earlier replaced by careful restraint. This name, he continued, his eyes flicking back to the receipt for just a second. It cannot be. And the words did not land as denial, but as disbelief, the kind that comes when something familiar shifts into a new shape. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, without triumph, his expression unchanged, not seeking validation, not demanding acknowledgement, just present, and in that stillness, the answer existed before it was spoken. The server's hand moved instinctively to her chest, a small, unconscious gesture as she watched the exchange, her earlier uncertainty now replaced by a quiet understanding that something significant was unfolding, something that would change the way this room was seen long after this moment passed. Ethan took a small step back, the distance creating space not for authority, but for perspective, his eyes moving briefly toward the photographs on the wall again, the curated history that now felt incomplete, and then back to Marcus, as if trying to reconcile the two versions of the same story. Marcus Reed, he said finally, the name leaving his mouth slower than it should have, as if it carried more weight now than it had just minutes before, and a ripple moved through the room, not sound, but awareness, the kind that spreads when something hidden becomes visible. A man near the back leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed, while the woman by the photographs placed her hand lightly on the table, her fingers still, her attention fully locked on Marcus, as if she had just realized she was sitting inside a story she did not understand. Ethan's grip on the receipt loosened slightly, the paper lowering to the table again, placed beside the $6 with a care that had not been present when he first dismissed them, and that single gesture, small as it was, marked a shift, not just in his understanding, but in the way he now approached the man in front of him. You were here, Ethan said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time, his voice steady but subdued, and the statement carried across the room, settling into the silence that followed. Marcus inclined his head just slightly, not a nod of agreement, but an acknowledgement of truth, and in that simple movement, the distance between what had been assumed and what was real collapsed completely, leaving the room suspended in a quiet that no longer felt uncertain, but certain in a different way, a way that did not need to be announced to be understood. The name did not just sit in the air, it settled into every corner of the room, reshaping the way people saw what had been right in front of them the entire time, and Ethan Whitmore stood there with the receipt still resting near his hand, his posture no longer defined by authority, but by something quieter, something more uncertain. As if he had stepped into a version of the room where he was no longer in control of how the story moved forward. He drew in a slow breath, his shoulders rising slightly before easing back down, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, stripped of its earlier sharpness. I did not know, he said, the words simple, almost insufficient, but real in a way his previous statements had not been, and the admission did not try to justify, did not try to explain, it simply existed. Marcus Reed did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, not hardened, not softened, just present, as if he had already accepted that this moment would come exactly as it had, without needing anything more from it. A subtle movement passed through the room as diners shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort now, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when a situation reveals more about everyone involved than they had intended to show. Ethan glanced briefly at the $6, then at the receipt, then back at Marcus, the sequence slow, deliberate, as if he was piecing together something larger. Then the objects themselves, and his hand moved again, this time not to dismiss, not to gesture, but to straighten the edge of the receipt against the table, aligning it carefully beside the bills, a small act of respect that spoke louder than anything he had said before. "You built this," Ethan continued, the statement forming as realization rather than assumption, and his voice carried across the room without effort, drawing every ear back to him, not because he demanded attention, but because the truth now did. Marcus's eyes flickered just slightly, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement, a quiet confirmation that required no elaboration, and in that subtle movement, the last of the doubt in the room dissolved. The server took a step closer, her hands now clasped lightly in front of her, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a calm attentiveness. As if she understood that what she was witnessing was not a confrontation, but a turning point, Ethan's gaze dropped for a moment, his focus narrowing on the table before him, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, not just recognition, but reflection, as if he was seeing himself from a distance for the first time, measuring his actions against something he had not considered before. "I spoke to you as if you did not belong here," he said, his tone steady but quieter now, the words carrying a weight that extended beyond the moment. "And I was wrong." And the admission settled into the room with a gravity that no one tried to interrupt, no one tried to soften. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle, almost imperceptible, and for the first time, his gaze softened just a fraction, not in forgiveness, not in judgment, but in understanding, as if he recognized the effort it took to arrive at that point, even if it had come late. Ethan took a small step forward, closing the distance again. But this time without the sharpness of authority, without the need to assert anything, his posture open, his hands no longer positioned to control, but to acknowledge. "If there is anything I can do," he began, then paused, the sentence catching before it could fully form, as if he realized that what he was about to offer might not be what this moment required, and that pause spoke volumes, revealing a shift not just in his words, but in his understanding of what mattered. The room remained silent, not tense, not uncertain, but attentive, every person present aware that they were witnessing something that could not be undone, something that would linger long after the night ended. And in that stillness, Marcus Reed stood exactly as he had before, grounded, calm, carrying a presence that no longer needed to be explained, because it had already changed the way the room saw him, and more importantly, the way it saw itself. Marcus Reed did not answer Ethan Whitmore's unfinished offer, not because he had not heard it, but because the moment no longer required words to complete it, and he let the silence settle once more, not heavy, not tense, but full, like something that had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be forced any further. His eyes moved briefly to the $6 and the receipt, the two small pieces that had carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded, and then he reached forward, not hurried, not hesitant, and gathered them together with a care that suggested they were never meant to stay behind. The soft sound of paper lifting from wood echoed more clearly than it should have, drawing every gaze to that simple motion, and for a second, it felt like the entire room was watching something more than just a man picking up his belongings. They were watching the closing of a circle they had not even known was open. Ethan stood still, his hands at his sides now, no longer gesturing, no longer attempting to guide the direction of the moment, his expression quiet, reflective, and there was a weight in the way he held himself, as if he understood that whatever he might say next would not change what had already been revealed. Marcus folded the receipt carefully, aligning its worn edges with practiced precision, then tucked it back into his coat, the motion familiar, almost ritualistic. And when he lifted his gaze again, it moved not just to Ethan, but across the room, taking in the faces that had laughed, the ones that had watched, the ones that had begun to understand, and there was no judgment in that look, no accusation, only a calm acknowledgement of what had been. The server lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back up, her expression softened, her posture no longer uncertain but grounded, as if she had learned something she would carry with her beyond this night. The man at the bar set his glass down gently, no longer turning it in his hand, his focus steady, thoughtful, and the woman near the photographs glanced once more at the framed images on the wall, seeing them differently now, not as a complete story, but as something that had been missing a piece. Marcus turned slightly, his body angling toward the entrance, and the movement was quiet, unannounced, but it drew the room with it, like a current shifting direction, and as he began to walk, each step was measured, steady, not hurried, not delayed, just forward. The polished floor reflected the faint outline of his movement, the warm lights casting a soft glow that followed him without needing to catch up, and as he passed the tables, no one spoke, no one interrupted. The silence now held not uncertainty, but respect, the kind that arrives too late to change what happened, but not too late to change what comes after. Ethan's gaze followed him, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to recognition, and when Marcus reached the door, the faint chime above it sounded softly as it opened, a simple note that seemed to mark the moment more clearly than any words could have. The cool air from outside slipped in briefly, brushing against the warmth of the room, and for a second, the contrast was unmistakable, the world beyond and the space within meeting at a single point before separating again. Marcus stepped out without looking back, the door closing gently behind him, the chime fading into silence, and the room remained as it was, still, aware, changed in a way that could not be undone. Ethan stood where he had been, his posture no longer rigid, his gaze lingering on the door long after it had closed, and then, slowly, he turned back toward the table. Toward the space where the $6 had been, now empty, but not forgotten, and in that quiet absence, the lesson remained, not spoken, not written, but felt, like a presence that would stay long after the night had ended, carried in the stillness of a room that had learned, too late, the difference between what is seen and what is true.